Hello watch enthusiasts, welcome back to my YouTube channel, Watches with Nick. Now, when people talk about watches connected to space exploration, one watch usually gets all the attention, and that would be the Omega Speedmaster Professional. It's famously known as the Moon Watch because it was worn during the Apollo missions. But what a lot of collectors don't realize is that another brand came surprisingly close to being part of that story. That's right. Today we're talking about the Longines Wittnauer Professional, and more specifically, the Wittnauer 7004A Professional, a really interesting vintage chronograph that represents a forgotten chapter of watch history. Let's start off with the origins of Wittnauer. The Wittnauer story actually begins in New York City in the late 1800s. The company was founded by Albert Wittnauer in 1885. His goal was to bring high-quality Swiss watches to the American market while also focusing on precision instruments used for navigation and exploration. Wittnauer quickly built a strong reputation, especially in aviation. In fact, the brand supplied instruments for pilots and explorers during a time when accurate timing was critical for navigation. One example being the dash clocks used in many Vietnam-era jets and World War II planes. One of the most famous moments came when aviation pioneer Amelia Earhart used Wittnauer timing instruments during her historic transatlantic flight. So from early on, Wittnauer was very much a tool watch brand, long before that term became popular. Now, let's talk about how the Wittnauer brand fused with Longines and formed a partnership. Eventually, Wittnauer formed a close relationship with the famous Swiss watchmaker Longines. By the mid-20th century, Longines actually acquired Wittnauer and used the company as a major distributor in the United States. This is why you often see watches from this era referred to as Longines Wittnauer. The partnership combined Swiss watchmaking with a strong American presence, and it led to some really interesting watches being produced in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. One of those watches was the Wittnauer Professional Diver and Chrono series, which includes the model I'm showing today. The watch I have here is the Wittnauer 7004A Professional, which is part of their professional timing line. One of the coolest things about this watch, and most notable to most collectors and enthusiasts, is that bezel. Collectors often call it the cherry bezel. I mean, just look how cool that looks. Not a lot of watches from this era used vibrant colors like this on their bezels. Another thing that collectors love about the watch are those thick, creamy tritium arrow hands and the lollipop seconds hand, which gives the watch its own special character in and of itself. Now, because of that bezel's deep cherry burgundy color, it's not something you see very often. And over time, a lot of these bezels have faded or have been replaced. So finding one with the original red tone is pretty special. Design-wise, the watch is exactly what you'd want from a vintage chronograph. You've got the robust Valjoux 7733 caliber. Now, let's take a closer look at this caliber a bit more closely. Now let's get back to the watch itself. You have a 39mm solid stainless steel case with crisp edges a smoothly rotating bidirectional timing bezel, and a very legible dial with absolutely gorgeous creamy tritium. The markers are bold and the hands are easy to read. I mean, just look how beautifully that tritium has aged over the time. It's not flashy, but that's exactly the point. Watches like this were made to be used, not just admired in a display case. Now, let's talk about how Wittnauer almost went to the moon. Now, here's where the story gets even more interesting. In the early 1960s, NASA began looking for a chronograph that astronauts could wear during space missions. Several brands submitted watches for testing, including Rolex with their Cosmograph, Breitling with the famous Navitimer 809, Omega with the very well-known Speedmaster Professional, and Wittnauer with the Genevieve Professional 242T. Just which Wittnauer chronograph was submitted for the trials is still kinda a matter of debate, but many in the watch community believe it to have been the 242T, although there's still no official or definitive proof from either NASA or Longines that this is the case. The 235T is another possible contender. However, there evidently do exist period-correct advertisements following NASA's qualification tests that claim the 242T as the possible Wittnauer entry. The watch has a matte black dial with 3 sub-registers with the running seconds at 9 o'clock, a 12-hour counter at 6 o'clock, and a 30-minute counter at 3 o'clock, each of which features a glossy ring around the sub-dial, after which there's a white inner minute/second track running through the sub-registers, and the main hour indices are really thick tritium plots. But here's the kicker. There's an outer decimal scale around the edge of the watch, which can prove somewhat confusing. What's this decimal scale, you might ask? Well, decimal time is a feature used commonly in aviation that breaks the day down into 10 decimal hours, each of which consists of 100 decimal minutes, further subdivided into 100 decimal seconds each. This feature is rarely seen on even vintage chronographs, and to our mind, further solidifies the case for the 242T having been submitted for NASA testing trials. The watch also has a thick loomed handset with a lollipop seconds hand, just like my 7004A. The watch also has pump pushers, an acrylic crystal, a screw-down case back, and a 39mm stainless steel case with nicely chamfered lugs and a 20mm lug width. Now, the watch is powered by the very famous Valjoux 72 hand-wound column wheel caliber. This caliber is very famous as it was used by Rolex, Heuer, and many other famous Swiss watch brands back then. Now, in the end, NASA then put these watches through some of the most brutal tests imaginable. Extreme temperature swings, intense vibration, decompression, and massive shock forces. The watch that passed the tests was the Omega Speedmaster Professional, which went on to become the official watch of the Apollo astronauts and eventually the first watch worn on the moon. But Wittnauer had actually been part of that early competition, which means the brand was closer to space history than most people realize. So while the Speedmaster became the moon watch, Wittnauer remains part of that forgotten group of watches that almost made it into the space program. That's part of what makes watches like the Wittnauer 7004A Professional so interesting today. They represent a time when watch companies were designing watches for real professional use, for pilots, divers, explorers, and even astronauts. And because Wittnauer never became as famous as some of the other watch brands, these watches still fly a little under the radar compared to other vintage tool watches. But that's actually part of the appeal. You're getting a piece of history, a great vintage design, and a story connected to the early days of exploration and the space race. The Longines Wittnauer Professional line may not have had the same fate as some other watches from the space era, but it represents a really fascinating part of watch history. And pieces like the 7004A with the cherry bezel show just how cool these forgotten tool watches can be. They remind us that for every legendary watch that made history, there were others right there alongside it, pushing the limits and almost changing the story. And sometimes those almost famous watches end up being some of the most interesting ones to collect. Thank you so much for listening to the story of the Wittnauer Professional line, and don't forget to like and subscribe to stay tuned for more interesting watch stories like this.